This is the Essential Podcast from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt. Geopolitics is driving markets. Perhaps that's always been true, but geopolitics has had a particularly obvious and direct effect on markets, certainly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the Houthi attacks on shipping, and renewed tensions in the Taiwan Strait, to name just a few examples. Geopolitics itself are not truly concerning. A trade war between the US and China may be inconvenient, but it is of particular concern because trade wars historically have served as a prelude for shooting wars. War is the big concern. It is not, in my opinion, with apologies to Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz, simply politics by another means. War is a state change in the global order. Geopolitical tensions and conflicts in the world make war an appropriate topic for a podcast like this one, although we are usually more concerned with economics and market events. And with that, it is my great pleasure to be joined on today's podcast by the historian Richard Overy. Professor Overy has written extensively on the Second World War and the period leading up to it, but his latest book takes a far broader view, taking on the question of war itself. The book is called Why War? Professor Overy takes up this question from a variety of perspectives, from evolutionary biology to psychology to anthropology and ecology. Professor Overy, I'd like to welcome you to the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
One of the things you say in your introduction to the book is very interesting to me. You call the book, or the writing of the book, an impertinence. And first of all, I love the word impertinence, but I was wondering, why is it an impertinence for a historian and a specialist, particularly the topic of the Second World War, to write about war in general?
Well, at one level, of course, it's not, because historians write about war all the time. I call it an impertinence because I very soon discovered, when I started to explore the way various disciplines have explained war, or tried to explain war, over the course of the last 50, 60, 70 years, that I've been looking at biology, at psychology, at ecology, at political science, but actually not a great deal at history. And I realized that these are all disciplines I know very little about, particularly biology. So I was on a learning curve. I enjoyed it a great deal, and I've learned a great deal, but that's what I really meant by this being something of an impertinence.
I'm wondering if we can back up for a second and ask the question, what is war, and how do you distinguish it from mere violence, or is that a meaningful distinction to make?
Well, I think many historians do make that distinction. They're very keen to see war as something which is pretty modern, something states do. But I've adopted a much wider definition, one which is commonly used, I think, by archaeologists or even anthropologists, which is to see collective violence as the critical factor. When human beings decide to undertake an act of collective violence against neighbors, against, a neighboring tribe or another state, we are looking at a form of warfare, and it usually is lethal, which is why I regard it as warfare. Now, there's obviously a huge difference between a tribal conflict or a band of hunter-gatherers massacring another band of hunter-gatherers. But the more I've looked at the past 10, 20, 30,000 years, the more you see a kind of continuum there. That's what people did 20,000 years ago, because that's the world they lived in. 20,000 years later, we threaten each other with nuclear bombs. That's the world we live in. But the common factor is that we are all thinking about the nature of collective violence, why it happens, how can we control it, what are its purposes.
One of the interesting points I thought you made in the section where you were looking at anthropological explanations for why war is you engage with Margaret Mead, who famously suggested that war is an invention. Certainly, we can sort of see where she might have been coming from, writing in the 1930s, following the First World War, sort of highly mechanized interstate war. You say specifically that Margaret Mead was wrong. Can you expand on that? Why wrong? Could it be that she was wrong due to different definitions of war, or is she just blanket wrong on the idea of war?
Well, no, I think the problem really was that she saw war as an invention, as if it was anything else that we might have invented, which we could then uninvent or get rid of. And she refused to accept that most of the tribal communities that she worked with were capable of violence or had been warlike, which turned out not to be true. But I think the real problem is that war is something it's completely different from the other things that she was talking about. War is, it's traumatic, destructive, lethal. It results in the killing of our own species in very large numbers. And so, in a sense, you've got to have a different kind of intellectual approach to it, rather than simply saying it's an invention, maybe we can uninvent it. Quite clearly, it's a phenomenon rooted somehow in the human condition. We need to understand why. We need to understand how it has developed that way. We need perhaps to understand, at some level, how we might limit it.
As a historian, you're obviously aware of the power and the impact of narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about our own history. Are you at all concerned about the impact of, say, or the difference between describing war as an aberration versus an inevitability, sort of a human inevitability? Is that to you a meaningful distinction?
Well, yes, it's an interesting question. I think many people would much rather have said it was an aberration, and that, at some point we'll get rid of it. But of course, everything you look at for the last 20, 30,000 years is clearly not an aberration. Clearly, it has function. And we can distinguish the various functions it performs and why people make war. We can understand why it is that people choose to make war. So, in that sense, it's, if you like, it's a pessimistic view of the human past. It's not something which happens by chance. In fact, in many of the modern periods, in other words, the last 3, 4, 5,000 years, war can be an almost permanent state for many communities. So rather than aberration, it's something which, we can see built into their culture, which they sustain culturally over a long period of time.
One of the things that has interested me for years is that there are, in some ways, two ways of looking at human experience. There's obviously we can follow Thomas Hobbes, right? Which, to use the classic short form, life is nasty, brutish, and short in a state of nature. Or we can follow sort of Locke and Rousseau and their somewhat more idealistic viewpoints on human nature. Do you feel, having done this incredible amount of research, do you feel yourself in one of these camps or the other?
Well, I hate to be in a camp, but I suppose I'm quite clearly in Hobbes' camp. It's not that that life is nasty, brutish, and short. I mean, the point he made simply was that for human communities, the elusive thing is security. Unless you've got some big godlike figure up there, with a big club that's going to hit you over the head if you all start fighting each other, you will go on fighting each other, because at the end of the day, nobody can be really secure, whether you're a bunch of hunter-gatherers, trying to protect your hunting territory, or indeed whether you're Vladimir Putin today, who's worried about the advance of NATO and the European Union towards the Russian frontier. And that's really what Hobbes was driving at. In the absence of any international force that can make us all stop fighting, fighting is going to break out. I should just, I don't want to interrupt you. I should just add, of course, that human beings are capable of cooperating, and they do cooperate all the time, of course. It's not a question that life is always nasty, brutish, and short. Life can be quite nice. But nevertheless, we're living in a world in which war is a phenomenon that will not go away.
The question, why war, which obviously informed the title of the book and certainly the topic of the book, comes from a question that Einstein posed to Sigmund Freud. It's clear from the book that, Freud's explanation, which was to posit the existence of a death drive, was not particularly persuasive to you. But as you looked across all of these different fields, from biology, evolutionary biology, through anthropology, psychology, and also ecology, that there had been different answers to this question over time. Which of these answers, as you were doing the deep work of this book, appealed to you?
Well, I suppose really it's the way in which modern evolutionary science has gone, whether it's evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology. I mean, both of them have a much more sophisticated explanation for the origin of collective violence. In the case of biology, where it was once thought it must be in our genes, we must have bellicose instincts and so on. Nobody really accepts that now. What the argument is that that violence was a key to biological survival for small human groups, very vulnerable to all kinds of things, natural shocks of one kind or another, predators and so on, but also other humans. One of the ways in which you could preserve your gene pool, if you like, was when necessary fighting. Either the argument is you went out and you fought and you seized women from another tribe and you brought them back, killed all the men, or the men of the tribe would gather together and always act to defend collectively and altruistically the tribal group. Now, psychology is clearly involved in that, and evolutionary psychologists argue that over time human beings developed a different set of psychological instruments, if you like. But one of them was that when necessary, you would resort to collective violence. And in general, that would be the men, but not, of course, the women. And that became reinforced over time as well, so that for early human communities, the fact of fighting was about your own survival, but, something that, in a sense, you came to accept psychologically, something which, would have to be done in order to make sure that survival could be guaranteed.
Through the book, you give many examples from the archaeological record, which seems to point to the fact that collective violence has at least been a recurring theme throughout human history. Some of these examples are honestly somewhat upsetting. Bones broken apart to extract the marrow, scalping, beheading, etc. When you look at all of those, is your natural conclusion that there is a human inclination towards violence or a human capacity for violence?
Well, I think it's a capacity for violence, but it's quite hard to separate these out because, as I was talking earlier, over evolutionary time, this is something that many human communities almost certainly began to take for granted, that there were going to be moments when you would have to fight somebody else to defend yourself or, to procure advantages for your particular tribe. And this, would bit by bit become a kind of inclination. And in modern cultures, i.e. the last 5, 6, 7,000 years, once human beings settled down and began to create, tribal communities and federations and states and so on, it's almost said that nobody really questioned that that's what you did. That, moments of crisis or moments when you needed to protect or enhance the interests of your group, you would engage in violence to do so.
Is there a distinction in your mind between wars of offense or wars of defense, or is that not necessarily meaningful as they play out over time?
Well, no, it is obviously a very important distinction. And anthropologists have shown that tribal communities, for example, will tend to react rather differently to wars of aggression and wars of defense. Wars of defense, everybody is rallied, even the women often, in defense of the community. For a war of aggression, it'll be a cohort, perhaps most males, but a cohort of males who are used to the idea that, at times they will have to be aggressive. And the pattern of that kind of war is so different. You go out, you find, your enemy tribe or your enemy, whatever it is, and, you generally massacre them, come back with the trophies. In defense, you're fighting for your life. And if you're not very good at it, you won't keep it.
The second part of the book focuses on what we might consider sort of reasons for war, and you include there sections on resources, belief, power, and security. It seems to me that there are sort of two categories there. There is resources and security, and then there's belief and power. Do you believe that you can make those distinctions between something that is in some way a necessity of survival, and on the other side, sort of more of a choice?
Yeah, no, there is a difference. I mean, the obvious thing, of course, is that they're not all mutually exclusive. There are many wars, of course, in which two or three of those might operate at the same time. The search for resources, to support a belief system, and so on and so on. But belief and power, yes, it's about conscious understanding that you're going to wage war because you have a particular purpose behind it, usually a purpose which meets the needs of your particular culture and the political interests of your leadership. When it comes to resources, it could be the whole tribe fighting, in order to get more resources so that they can, survive or expand their interests. When it comes to security, as I said at the beginning in my views on Hobbes, security is common in fact to almost all wars, because there's always a sense in which you're fighting a war in order to maintain your security or extend your security or protect your security in one way or another, even if the war itself is dressed up in the language of belief or the pursuit of power. And that's, I think, it gives security a rather different character from the other three.
Returning to your area of specialty, you've written extensively on the Second World War. There have been debates over time about the role of security and resources in Hitler's decision to initiate war. To what extent do you find those arguments persuasive or unpersuasive?
Well, I think they're very persuasive. I mean, the interesting thing about both Japanese imperialism and German imperialism is that they were driven, of course, by a desire to be like the other great powers. They felt that they'd been, shortchanged, and they wanted to sit up there at the top table. But the only way you could sit at the top table was by making sure you had adequate resources to be able to sustain that role. And for the Japanese, that meant seizing resources in China and Southeast Asia. For Germany, in the end, that meant seizing resources in Central and Eastern Europe, and in the end in the Soviet Union. And although the war could be also dressed up in ideology or belief systems or whatever, a driving factor there was to seize resources, because resources would be the foundation on which you could then make your claim to great power status.
To what extent do you think similar motivations are active today? On the one hand, in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and on the other hand, sort of the conflict between the United States and China?
Well, they're two rather different conflicts. And the case of Ukraine and Russia, as I said before, I think the driving force of Putin, of course, is security, and his growing sense of insecurity as Russia has declined as a power and as a military power, as the West pushes further and further into Eastern Europe. You can see why the Russian leadership is worried about what that means, and is looking around for allies who will support them in their rejection of the West. That there's a frontier here. You're not coming any further. What between the United States and China has been regarded by political scientists as a classic example of what they call power transition theory, where you get a relatively declining power and you get a rising power, one hegemon goes down, one hegemon comes up, and at some point there's bound to be a war between them. In fact, almost all the historical examples one can find, it doesn't happen like that at all. The hegemons actually, on the whole, tend to get on all right. Britain, the United States, is perhaps the best example of that. Where one gave up global leadership and passed it on to the next. So I don't think that's necessarily a source for war. The problem is for China. But China is so awkward about its frontiers, a bit like Russia, and is anxious to make sure that its frontiers meet its requirements. That its frontiers match its view of where its frontiers ought to be, i.e., Taiwan, and that's much more likely to drive potential conflict than rivalry between China and the United States, which is, I think, a contest much exaggerated.
Richard, I'd like to end with an observation, if I could, and I hope you will take this as a compliment. It's certainly intended in that way. Reading your book, I was struck by the fact that it's called Why War? And what you did is not so much answer the question of why war as you asked the question better than it has ever been asked before. It was a full encapsulation of the question of why war. Was that something you were consciously thinking as you were writing it?
Yes, it was, I think. I mean, I'm sure people would like me to have an answer straight away, like, Einstein hoped that Freud would have an answer straight away. And so, I'm not actually setting out to say, this is why all wars occur, therefore we can get rid of it. But I do think that we have, we have better and better explanations for why war happens, and better explanations for why war has been, a part of the human past for as far back as we can go. And I would like to think that in 100 years' time, we're not fighting each other, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I think that the real problem with this is that we can explain war in all kinds of ways, sophisticated ways and so on. But in the end, understanding why war happens isn't necessarily going to stop it from carrying on.
Well, the book, once again, is Why War, written by Professor Richard Overy. I encourage everyone to read it. It is fascinating and engaging and deep. Richard, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you.
The Essential Podcast is produced by Patrick Moroney. At S&P Global, we accelerate progress in the world by providing intelligence that is essential for companies, governments, and individuals to make decisions with conviction. From the majestic heights of 55 Water Street in Manhattan, I am Nathan Hunt. Thank you for listening.